We're told central banks exist to protect economies, to fight inflation, to stabilize markets, to prevent collapse. But here's the uncomfortable mystery no one likes to ask. How did institutions that supposedly don't own anything end up influencing everything? They don't run companies, they don't build factories, they don't elect leaders. Yet today, central banks sit behind the largest asset booms in history, decide which markets survive crises, and quietly shape the fate of nations. So how did they do it? Not with armies, it's not with elections, but with balance sheets. This is the story of how central banks quietly bought the world. To understand the present, we have to rewind to a time when central banks barely existed. For centuries, money was physical. Gold, silver, coins you could touch. Governments minted currency directly. Banks were intermediaries, not masters. When wars were fought, rulers taxed or borrowed temporarily. Debt was dangerous. Too much debt meant loss of sovereignty. Even early central banks, like the Bank of England in the 1600s, were created for specific purposes. Funding wars, managing state borrowing. No one imagined they would one day dominate global finance. But buried inside their original design was a quiet shift, one that would only reveal its power centuries later. The first key change was subtle but revolutionary. Instead of governments creating money outright, money began entering the economy through loans. Central banks issued currency by lending it to governments, banks, and eventually markets. This meant every unit of money came with interest, obligation dependence at first. This seemed harmless. Borrowing fueled growth, credit expanded trade. Industrialization exploded. But one critical flaw was baked into the system. Interest was never created alongside the principal, which meant the system required continuous expansion of debt to survive. The moment borrowing slowed, crisis followed. Central banks weren't just managing money anymore. They were managing time, pushing repayment into the future. For most of the 20th century, central banks claimed neutrality. They set interest rates. They acted as lenders of last resort. They stayed behind the curtain. Then came the turning point. The Great Depression shattered trust in markets. World War II reshaped the global order. After 1945, central banks were given unprecedented authority. And after 1971, when the gold standard ended, money lost its final anchor. From that moment on, currency was backed by nothing but confidence and central bank credibility. This is when power quietly accelerated. Interest rates became the steering wheel of the global economy. Lower rates meant more borrowing, higher asset prices rising, inequality. Higher rates meant crashes, recessions, unemployment. Central banks claimed they were just responding to markets. In reality, markets began responding to them. The system worked until it didn't. By the early 2000s, debt levels were unprecedented. Households borrowed, corporations borrowed, governments borrowed. Then came 2008. The global financial system collapsed under its own weight. Banks failed. Markets froze. Trust evaporated. This should have been the end of reckless finance. Instead, it was the beginning of something far bigger. Central banks stepped in not as referees but as buyers. They slashed interest rates to zero, created trillions of dollars, euros, and yen. They bought government bonds, corporate bonds, even mortgage securities. This was called quantitative easing. But in simple terms, it meant one thing. Central banks began buying the financial system itself. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Central banks didn't technically own companies. But by buying massive amounts of financial assets, they propped up stock markets, kept zombie companies alive, lowered borrowing costs, selectively decided which markets survived crises. Asset prices soared while wages stagnated. Those who owned assets got richer. Those who didn't fell further behind. The world entered an era where markets stopped pricing risk. Crises were rewarded with bailouts. Failure was socialized. Gains were private. Central banks insisted there was no alternative. But with every intervention, they became more entangled. They couldn't stop without crashing everything they had inflated. After each crisis, central banks promised normalization. Interest rates would rise, balance sheets would shrink, markets would stand on their own. It never lasted. Why? Because the system became addicted to cheap money. Raising rates threatened government budgets, corporate debt, housing markets, pension systems, so every attempt to step back triggered panic. Each panic justified more intervention. The solution became the problem became permanent. Today, central bank balance sheets exceed $30 trillion globally. They influence bond markets, stock valuations, housing prices, currency flows in some countries. Central banks are among the largest holders of government debt. In others, they indirectly support entire financial sectors. Crises no longer reset the system. They reinforce it. Pandemics, wars, banking scares. Each time, the response is the same. Print by stabilize, the world doesn't collapse, but it becomes more dependent. The pattern repeats, only bigger. Here's the key clarification. This wasn't a conspiracy hatched in a room. It was a structural outcome. Central banks didn't wake up one day and decide to buy the world. They were pushed thereby. Debt-based money, political pressure, market fragility, fear of collapse. But intention doesn't change consequence. The consequence is this: a global system where financial power is centralized, opaque, and increasingly untouchable. Final takeaways first. Central banks gained power not by force, but by crisis response. Second, asset buying blurred the line between stabilization and control. Third, a system that cannot tolerate failure eventually cannot tolerate freedom. Warning: the question that remains, if central banks cannot stop intervening without collapse, what happens when intervention stops working? And who pays the price when confidence, the last backing of money, finally breaks? If you want to understand the hidden mechanics behind money, power, and global finance, beyond headlines and politics, subscribe to History of Money Power. Because the most important decisions shaping the world today aren't made in parliaments. They're made quietly, on balance sheets, behind closed doors.